Thank you for tuning in to another episode of InRange. I'm coming to you from Madison, Indiana, on the banks of the Jordan River, and we're on our way to the promised land to the north. You're going to say that doesn't make a lot of sense. The Jordan River isn't even in the United States, never mind Indiana. And what's the promised land? Well, these are terms of obfuscation used by something called the Underground Railroad. The Underground Railroad was a system of people, homes, and networks which was devised to help escaped slaves from the south make it to the promised land, which was Canada in the north, because you have to know, they weren't even free in the north, never mind the south. However, this is a topic that has to include topics about slavery, punishment, rebellion, and retribution. These are very mature topics, so viewer discretion is advised. An honest discussion of history is sometimes a difficult thing, because the origins of the United States is something in which we have to consider the fact that a lot of the United States' success is built on the back of slavery. From the origins of this country, starting with the Revolutionary War up until the end of the Civil War, and even up until today, considerations of slavery are still paramount and relevant. That being said, after the Revolutionary War, the northern states were pretty much abolitionists in their morals and causes. They passed laws that made slavery illegal or not really profitable in their states. The South, being a more rural and agrarian society, could not really do that, necessarily for economic reasons, but also for moral and cultural reasons. This caused a great divide within the country. You had the North and the South. The North being free states, in air quotes, we'll get to that in a minute. The South being slave states, also in quotes, and we'll get to that in a minute. However, in 1793, the Fugitive Slave Act was passed by Congress, in which they stated that an escaped slave, even in the North, could be arrested by an agent of the South and brought back to their master. This got worse in 1850 with an augmentation of it called the 1850 Fugitive Slave Act, in which they made it a requirement for someone who, if they suspected that someone was an escaped slave, to not only report them, but be participatory in arresting them and getting them back to their slave masters. The only requirement involved to determine if this person was potentially a slave or not was reasonable suspicion, and that was not defined. That meant that anyone of color was reasonably suspicious as a slave, and in fact there were many circumstances in which mercenaries from the South, or even people from the North, would get black people arrested, deported back to the slave states, and put into the slave trade, even in circumstances in which that person was already a free black man. I'd like to reference the book 12 Years a Slave, as well as the movie, in which something of that note actually happened. If you haven't seen that film, I recommend you do so very soon. With that in mind, the passion to be free is something that's inherent in all humans, all of us, regardless of race, creed, morals, or ethics. Freedom is something we all desire. A slave in the South did not want to be a slave. They were brought there against their will. They were brought there either on a ship or by someone as a slaveholder or a slave master, sold in the slave trade. In 1808, the Jefferson administration prevented the importation of slaves from abroad. A black market opened up in which that importation continued. However, this also instigated another unintended consequence. This meant that the slaves that were already within slave states became more valuable as human cattle or property. It also meant that a breeding operation started to exist in which the current slaveholders would not import slaves from externally, but would actually breed them within their plantations and then sell them as actual cattle or human cattle. This has resulted in human slave trade markets, the biggest of one in New Orleans, Louisiana, in which families were actually torn apart and sold for their value, male, female, age, capabilities. This breeding program became something that was profitable and was another byproduct of profit for the slaveholding states. So as mentioned earlier, there are certain people that just cannot tolerate being subjugated into slavery, and they attempt to escape. Now the retribution for being caught as an escaped slave is intense. Let's go through the process for escape in the first place. 1, you're on a plantation in which there's an overseer watching the entire area, as well as your other slaves might actually report you for doing as such because they're scared about retribution against themselves. So this was a very brave move to make. You probably are illiterate, you can't read signs, you don't necessarily know the direction you're going except north. Perhaps someone's educated you that the Big Dipper points north, and that's the way to the Underground Railroad. So you start going north. You somehow escape the overseer, probably under the cover of darkness, out of the way of this plantation or slave camp. Eventually, if you're lucky, you probably made it to here, which is Madison, Indiana, where the Ohio River is at some points in the season low enough that it's only 4 feet deep, meaning you can cross it by foot without necessarily swimming. You scrawl up the banks of the Ohio River, and you're now officially out of the slave states into the quote-unquote free states. Now you're not so free. The 1793 Fugitive Slave Act, as well as the 1850 Fugitive Slave Act, means that if you're here at this point and anyone determines you to be a slave or thinks you're an escaped slave, they're probably going to report you to the authorities and get you arrested. as well as there's mercenaries coming from the south looking for you with descriptions of you, your name, your appearance, your age, the plantation you escaped from. If you're lucky enough at that point to be detected or be found by the Underground Railroad, you'll be moved from one station to the other, which are homes or safe houses, by conductors. The conductors are the people of the Underground Railroad that are willing to, under the possible retribution of the law, help you as an escaped slave make it to Canada. Each one of them doesn't necessarily know the next location beyond the one that they know about, for obfuscation reasons we'll get to later. However, if you are caught and brought back to quote-unquote justice in the slave states, retribution for this is extreme. Cut off limbs, broken limbs, hobbling, chains, hot boxes, you're placed under the ground in a closed environment, suffocating, sweating to death for days. These are things, only a few of the things that might happen to you. Castration. The list goes on and on. The pictures are numerous, and it's something that we haven't really discussed very openly in our society about the retribution that was brought to these slaves for that type of an escape attempt. If you make it through the Underground Railroad, all the way through those processes and make it to free Canada, you might actually find out that it's not so great up there either. A lot better than being a slave and under the subjugation of a slave master who pretty much could kill you or sell you at whim, but you're still dealing with a racist society trying to make the best you can. I mentioned earlier in the video the concept of an abolitionist, but we didn't really talk about what abolitionism is or how it started. Abolitionism started by a concept of English and American Quakers, a sect of Christianity in which they believed that slavery was against their moral code, or the moral code of Christianity. This is a pretty obvious concept. You didn't need to be a Quaker to realize that there was a moral question involved in enslaving human beings. This concept grew, of course, much more in the North than in the South. But Madison, Indiana, a state that was already specifically anti-slavery based on its origins in 1816, pretty much was sympathetic to the abolitionist cause. We're standing in the Georgetown district, which in 1820 and on was one of the largest free black communities in the North, especially in Indiana. So this entire homestead that you see behind me was owned and lived in by freed blacks in a community pre-Civil War. A lot of people don't realize that there was ability to be a free black, not a slave, until after the Civil War. This existed well before. That said, in 1850, the Fugitive Slave Act made it that it was impossible for anyone here to feel safe or free, because the reality was anyone that suspected that you were an escaped slave could have you arrested, detained, and possibly deported back to the slave states for the purposes of determining if you were a slave or not. Your ability to actually prove that you were a free black versus a slave black was almost impossible. Once again, reference the film and book 12 Years a Slave. One thing you need to also consider is that being a free black in the North or in the South didn't really mean so much. The ability to be literate, to be educated in reading and writing was frequently restricted or actually specifically illegal, and the ability to own or possess a firearm was almost illegal across the board. So this was not really freedom. It really was a gray man's state of existence, and you weren't ever truly free, and after 1850 you were always at risk of being placed back into the slavery system. So I'd like to bring to your attention right now one of the heroes of the Underground Railroad, Elijah Anderson. Elijah Anderson moved to the Madison, Indiana area in 1837 and had his home built in 1840 on 624 Walnut Street, right here in the heart of the Georgetown district. There's a good reason he moved to the Georgetown district, because he was actually a free black man, but he was ever so pale-skinned that he also could pass as a white man, which made him a very unique person in terms of being able to be effective on the Underground Railroad. When escaped slaves made it to this station of the Georgetown district, he would act as a slave master and transport them on the highways of the day via steamship to a station very far north, therefore helping them move faster than they could have on foot. In the Madison area, he helped over 800 freed or escaped slaves get to the next station, and in another location in Indiana, he moved over 1,000. That means this man alone was culpable and responsible for helping over 1,800 escaped slaves possibly make it to the freedom of the promised land of the North. Kentucky was not a fan of this man. They put a $1,000 bounty on his head in their dollars of that day. Not $1,000 today, $1,000 then. Kentucky authorities brought him back to Kentucky for charging. They charged him for eliciting the escape of slaves. and convicted him with 8 years in prison. He spent 4 of those years in prison, and they were going to let him out early. 1 month before the onset of the Civil War, the day he was going to be released, the next day, he was found mysteriously dead in his cell. He never got out. I want to thank you for watching this very important historical vignette here on InRangeTV. We do these once in a while. We're going to have a few more about the Underground Railroad, so stay tuned for that. If you like this kind of content, please consider supporting us on Patreon. Patreon is the only place we get funding to do projects like this. We have no monetization outside of Patreon. InRange is truly supported by the viewer like you. If you can't support us via Patreon, I completely understand. You can find all of our distribution networks on InRange.tv. Please just subscribe to them and share with your friends. Thank you for watching.